Okay. My name is Francis Martin. I first started working in orchards at Elm Hill Farm in Brookfield, Mass, where Elsie the cow was born. I worked there for a man by the name of Lee Boyce. His grandson, Russell Powell, has written this book here, and we know Russ fairly well. Russ's father also had an orchard in Brookfield. Okay. He was just like as a pretty good guy. Anyway, later on I bought a small orchard in North Brookfield, Mass. that had been operated by Meyer Grace. It had been abandoned for a number of years, and the trees were quite tall. So I asked around and found out that there were several orchardists who had reduced the height of their Macintosh trees greatly. So I went to see a fellow by the name of Jesse Rice in Wilbraham, Mass. And Jesse said you could cut at least 10 feet off of the top of the tree, maybe 15. So anyway, I went at it in this orchard and brought it back. In each spray, I put fish emulsion. I found a hardware store that was going out of business, and I bought all the fish emulsion that they had. So on early apple, red astrakhan, the leaves were enormous like that from the spray, and produced beautiful apples. Anyway, there were a number of old varieties there, and so I got to know about them and how to grow them and all that kind of stuff. These are all varieties that were grown in Enfield. They're on the list of Enfield apples. That is at the Swift River Valley Historical Society. The oldest apple here is an apple called Lady, which is a Christmas apple. They're very small, but they're extremely delicious. And they were in the court of Louis XIII in the early 1600s. But their ancestry has been traced back to Roman times. It's an apple that you don't want to peel because all the flavor is in the peeling. The oldest American grown apple is the Roxbury russet. There is another golden russet that was grown here also, which is much smaller. The golden russet has drier flesh, and so when they made cider, they would only get 3 gallons out of a bushel, as opposed to 4 on the average for most apples. The other apple that is very old is the Rhode Island greening, and that was discovered in the 1600s. When I worked at Elm Hill Farm, for a while I was working in the cooler, and the packing line would send the boxes of apples there, and back then they would put a piece of cardboard over the bushel with a stencil telling what size it was and what variety, and then they would put 2 strips of pine over that to hold it down and nail it in place. So when I was working in the cooler, I developed a brilliant technique of stealing a Rhode Island greening by bending the board up just slightly and pull it out. So one day I went to work, and Lee Boy said to me, "You like Rhode Island greenings?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, come with me." On the cooler in the corner, he had a box of Rhode Island greenings. He said, "Those are yours." He said, "Don't touch the other ones." So Anyway, Lee was very good to work for. One time as we all went out to pick, he said, if I catch anybody throwing apples, I'm going to fire them on the spot. So anyway, I was picking apples. This other worker threw 3 apples at me, and then finally I threw an apple at him and hit him right off the head just as Lee boys came over the hill on the trail. So I go, oh no. So we went into the apple barn at the end of the day, and Lee says to me, Francis, come here. So I went up back. He said, I want to give you a 25-cent raise per hour, he says, because you're such a good worker. Anyway, a lot of these, like the Baldwin, at one time, by 1920, the Baldwin apples comprised 50% of the American apple crop. And the Rhode Island greening was another 25%, so 3/4 of the American crop was between these 2 apples, between this one and this one. Roxbury russets they used to ship to England in barrels. A barrel would hold 2 3/4 bushels, and because they were such good keepers. And you have to realize that back then they didn't have refrigerated cooling. Not until after 1920. So they used to call that common storage. In other words, it'd be like in cellars, and sometimes it would be in a structure made out of stone, and sometimes faced with cork boarding to keep the cold in. And there would actually be a brook running right through the storage area to keep the apples moist. Then after 1920, they came up with refrigerated cooling, and the attempt was to keep the temperature between 32 and 34 degrees. Macintosh was slowly entering the marketplace, but it was slow because they had to deal with common storage until the refrigerator came along. But even then, they wouldn't last much longer than January. So in 1940, Cornell developed what is called controlled atmosphere storage. They take about 25% of the oxygen and reduce it to 2.5%, and the temperature is kept, 32 to 34. And that way, they could market Macintosh all the way into June of the next season. Now, the way that they regulate the storage depends on the variety of apple that they have in there. It varies from variety to variety. Baldwins would keep pretty much into the springtime, as would Hubbardston, Rhode Island greening, and Roxbury russet, and northern spy. Now, one of the problems with a lot of these old varieties is that they were biennial. So you might have half of your orchard not bearing fruit. So the northern spy is a regular producer, and so is the Hubbardston and Macintosh. Now the Macintosh probably has more strains than any other variety. There are 28 strains of Macintosh, including strain in Pittsburgh. And on the farm that we used to own, there's a strain at UMass called a Leighton Macintosh, after the people that owned it. There are more varieties of where the Macintosh is apparent than any other variety. Everything you can think of, even the Spencer now is an apple variety that is very popular. That's a cross between Macintosh and Golden Delicious. There's also an apple called Shamrock, which is a bright green apple. And that is a cross between a Spur Macintosh and a Spur Golden Delicious. Now, some trees are spur producing, and so these fruit spurs are quite dominant all along the limb. They bear a little later than the other apples. We had spur macs where on our farm they were 100% red. Our pack out on Macintosh was 94% extra fancy and fancy, the highest in the state, because our farm was varied from 1,200 to 1,600 feet above sea level. This is an apple called sheep nose. It's been around for a long while. It's not a great apple, it's just unusual, you know. But on the place below where we live, there was an old sheep nose tree. And,
oh, Jay. Sorry, you probably understood.
so at one time, it was not uncommon for Boston and New York to ship out 1,500 barrels of Baldwins, to Europe. Now at first they were shipping directly like from Boston across to Europe, but they found that it was costing them too much money. So then they started shipping through Nova Scotia. Now the Nova Scotians have a different barrel shape than the American barrel. It was wider and straighter size. The American barrels, of course, they have a curve like that. But they had standard sizes for all of the parts to the barrel. And so there were people that were involved in just making barrels for the apple industry. There were some farms that had lofts over their apple barn, and they could store as many as 1,000 barrels for the upcoming season. So, if you go into the supermarkets now, early in the fall, and you're looking for early apples, you'd be lucky to find them, because now they can get apples from all over the world at any time they want them. So instead of getting apples like red astrakhan, for instance, or Milton Macintosh, which is an early Mac, it's a cross between yellow transparent and Macintosh again. And even apples like Paula Red, which were a sensation when they hit the market. They were a discovery in Michigan. They were apples like Puritan, which was a Macintosh cross with red astrakhan. The reason it didn't do well is because it was not a sweet apple. Still an apple around Quabbin, which actually came from Denmark and came to the United States. It was a very good cooking apple, and it's still grown in some of the orchards. One discovery that I made at the Dickinson Orchard, which my wife and I take care of, is an apple called the Toulmin Sweet. It was discovered in 1700, before 1700 in Dorchester, Mass. And it was prized as a cider apple. It has a pear flavor, and it's a very good keeper. This is Hubbardston, which was discovered in Hubbardston, Mass. Very nice apple, you know, very similar to a Baldwin, but we used to have 15 acres of Northern Spy, but ours were red spies. They were completely really beautiful apple. And when people found out that they were ready, within 2 weeks we'd be sold out. One year a guy came there who made apple slices. He sold to people like Atkins and so forth. He said he would take the whole crop. Well, he never showed up. And so I wound up making a deal with a produce stand, gradually getting rid of them all. The next season, he shows his ugly face and he says, I had trouble getting paid last year and I'd like to get them. I said, sorry. I said, I'm really sorry. I said, if you can pay me cash, fine. But I said, no deal. Oh, I thought I could count on you. He says, I thought I could count on you last year too, you know. But anyway, a lot of the, what happened with the Baldwin, Roxbury russet, and Rhode Island green in they bear every other year. And so after Cornell made all their Macintosh crosses and came up with Cortland, Cortland then one time they found that it was too expensive to ship out of Boston and New York. So they found out that it would be cheaper to ship through Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia had different barrels than those in the United States. And they were more round and wider, so they were easier for them to stack on the ships.
Whatever, no big deal. I said, send it to me, I'll print it for you.
Later on, when Macintosh was, they were able to store it longer.
Yeah.
They used to ship Macintosh to England, and
I know, but then you have to, right.
over there they used to call them Mac Reds, and they would want the small apples, and they would sell them on the streets of London and also in Ireland. Then growers in the British Islands petitioned for a excessive excise tax, so it was no longer profitable to ship them there. There are a lot of changes in the industry. For instance, Baldwin trees, they would allow to grow 35 feet tall. And I have pictures where the pickers are using extension ladders. It's up so high. They did that because their plantings were 40 by 40 feet. So they needed to get more yield out of an acre. At the Malling experiment station in England, they came up with a number of dwarfing rootstocks. And so now, at the Dickinson Orchard, we've planted 8 varieties on Bud 9, which is Budowska line. It gives you a tree about 10 feet tall. Well, they had varieties at that orchard. I discovered this Toulmin Sweet there, which they had nowhere in the records. So I suspect because the women were using it for cooking and the men used it for cider, that they didn't have it in their diaries and so forth. There's another unidentified tree there that I have to identify.
Yep.
But they had Baldwin, Roxbury russet, Toulmin Sweet, early harvest, golden sweet, yellow bellflower.
Westfield, seek no further.
Westfield Seek No Further. And I did a lot of seeking for Westfield Seek No Further. No one in Westfield grows it. But at the time when it came out, it was, took the valley like a storm. There are a couple places around. One place I went to pick them up, and they were all out of them and sold them out.
How do you identify the varieties?
What's that?
How do you identify the varieties?
How do I what?
They all look like apples. How do you tell one variety from another so that when you go to an orchard?
Well, if you go into an orchard, these apples all have different growth habits. The trees, some of them bloom early, some late. I mean, I can tell because but I have enough reference material so that I can trace it down. Like this Toulmin Sweet, with quite a job to identify it. The trunk is a dark brown. The apple has a certain shape. I mean, there are all kinds of different shapes for apples. And also the way that they bear. Some of them bear at the very tips. Others bear all the way inside the tree. And some of them are harder apples and last longer. You take an apple like Yellow Transparent, which came from Russia. It's an early apple, about that big around, a bright yellow apple. And it's excellent for applesauce, but only lasts about 2 weeks. One time I sold, I don't know, maybe a dozen bushels of red astrakhan to a guy at a produce stand. And I think he had a drinking problem to begin with, but anyway, he put them in a trailer, a truck trailer, the body. Next week when they came, he wanted to know if I'd take them back. I said, "You gotta be kidding me," hot September weather and so forth. "Oh, I don't know what I'm going to do, how I'm going to explain it to my wife." I said, "You better think up something good." I said, "Because I'm not able to take them back." I mean, you knew that when I brought them here, But I've had all kinds of experiences with. We used to ship apples to Pear Supreme, which has stores all the way from Maine all the way down to New Jersey. We had Food Mart as an account, but they moved. I used to do all the food co-ops in Western Massachusetts. And in Amherst alone, 3 of them went out of business, and then the one in Northampton went out. And I was shipping to Nefco, which sells to a lot of co-ops. But I mean, you have to be traveling in the middle of the night, At Waltham, where Purity Supreme has their warehouses, they had 121 docks, and they would call up and say, "Be there at 3:20 in the morning, and we want this, and this." So this old fellow who was the dock master, he took me to one side. He says, "You want to be careful with these people." He said, "They'll order from you 3 weeks in a row." He said, "Then the 4th week," he said, "they're going to lowball it on you." He said, "Just tell them you don't have them available that week." So I did. But, anyway, it's a tough business. There were times in the past when there were orchards that had like 800 acres, and they had to cut way back. So, are there any questions?
I have a suggestion. I don't think that most people understand about the rootstocks, which I didn't understand until we moved to the farm. I think you should talk a little bit about, I think a lot of people think you just go and that's the tree, and that's the kind of a tree. So I think you need to explain about rootstock a little bit.
Anyway, the rootstock is, they grow them separate from any variety of tree. And they're grown specifically because they're classed a certain rootstock. So you can get a standard rootstock which will produce an enormous tree. You can get something like M111, which is 80 or 90% of that. And there are M7s, M27, M9, I mean, all that kind of stuff. There's even a group of Polish rootstocks, P1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the same thing with pears. They used to like to grow pear varieties on quince rootstock, but now they have some hybrids that they developed, which will produce a tree about 50% the height of a pear tree.
Explain how they attach. I don't think most people know that.
Well, they have to be grafted. The variety has to be grafted onto the rootstock. Okay, and you have to make a cut so that the variety and the rootstock match.
Almost like mortise and tenon or something.
Yeah, yeah. And then you put in. They used to use beeswax. Now they have different formulas. And then it's overwrapped. And partway through the season, you have to take the elastics off, otherwise it'll smother the tree.
If you look at an apple tree, can you see the place where the tree
Yes.
is grafted?
Yeah, usually
near the base?
down near the ground about that far up, you'll see a bulge. That's the graft. Okay.
Same on roses and stuff like that too.
Now, grafting is not new. They used to do it in Roman times. As a matter of fact, there are illustrations of the Roman people doing the grafting. Apples came from a place called Uzbekistan in what was in the Russian
So it's the
Empire.
Uzbekistan.
Yeah. I have a cold, so I'm not. Are there any other questions? No?
Do you think in the valley, like in infield, that they specifically grew those varieties, or?
Yeah. Now the lady apple, growers would grow these to make money around Christmas. And the florists used to take these and they would attach them to wreaths. And they would set up displays that you could put on your table and all that kind of stuff. But this is actually a connoisseur's apple. It's very, very delicious.
Where do you find all these unusual kinds these days? I mean, your average store sells some basic apples, but you've got some different ones. Who sells those now?
Well, you'd have to go to an orchard, or there are some organic stores that sell it. But one of the difficulties with these things is that most of them are biennial. Also, they require several pickings when they're ripening. That was okay when you had your own farm and you didn't want to be inundated with apples, so you would pick them as you needed them. You go into the supermarket, you're not going to find anything like that.
Are these all at Emily Dickinson's homestead?
What's that?
Are these all at the Emily Dickinson house?
No. At the we don't have apples here yet.
No.
We don't have any because
But
this
you
past
can name
spring,
the varieties.
the first group of trees.
But you know the varieties that they have there,
Yeah,
that they planted, the
These
Roxbury.
apples are from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Except for that one that he found there, that he identified.
Oh, yeah, the Toulmin.
Yeah.
So anyway, we used to grow pears in a lot of these places. The monks around Detroit planted pear trees. There's one pear tree there that is 450 years old and still bears a crop. But most of the pears that were grown are French or Belgian pears. A lot of them were very susceptible to fire blight, which is a bacterial disease, and so they shied away from those. And one pear variety I was looking for the Dickinson Museum was a pear called Tyson, which when it came out, it was supposed to displace one of the early pears, Clapp's favorite, because Clapp's favorite was susceptible to fire blight, but it never flew. So, but they had it at the Dickinson Orchard, Tyson. Only 2 places in the country that have that pear tree. So, oh, thank you very much.